everyone. Welcome to our videos for week 4. Wow, the semester's going by kind of fast. Today we'll have 2 different videos using the same PowerPoint. So I'll put one PowerPoint in the file in our folder for today. But they'll be split the videos because we're covering a lot this week. So this first video, I'm going to talk about character development. So let me share my screen. Okay. Today I want to start talking about character. Basically, if you don't have solid characters, you almost don't have a story. And by almost, I mean you really don't. Basically, characters are who is in my story and who do they interact with and why are they doing the things they do. I'm going to use some tips that I got from Readsy.com, and I will post this link in our folder for this week as well if you want to read a little bit more about them. And as an illustration, I'm borrowing from television. I just finished rewatching The Good Place because it's my feel-good, happy show. And I really love that show because it does a lot with character growth and development. Probably better than almost any other show I've seen. If you haven't seen it, The Good Place follows 4 humans and 1 non-human celestial being and a celestial assistant, I guess, for lack of a better term. But everything that happens revolves mainly around one character, Eleanor Shellstrop, who is pictured in this slide. Basically, Eleanor dies and wakes up in what she's told is the good place. And as she's being introduced to the good place by Michael, who is the architect and that celestial being, she realizes that they've gotten her mixed up with someone else named with the same name, that she was actually not a good person. She calls herself an Arizona dirtbag in many points. But as the series goes on, they start uncovering more and more. So at the end of the first season, she realizes they're actually in the bad place. They are being punished. And this was all set up to kind of drive them a little, I don't want to say crazy, but to cause some like mental and emotional distress, that kind of torture. But through the next several seasons, not only are they able to change themselves and to continue to grow, but they also change other people around them. They change Michael, who starts out as this like torture demon, to someone who ends up really realizing that he's looked at humanity wrong from the beginning. So it's a quick backstory. And there's a lot more that goes into it. And it uses a lot of things from moral philosophy to strengthen what they're looking at. But anyway, so the things we're going to look at today, these tips, are you want to justify the character's reason for existence, make sure they have strengths and flaws, make sure that there's good conflict both internally and externally, give them a solid backstory, decide if they're static or dynamic, and develop their external characteristics and distinctive mannerisms. And then do some research to make them believable. And we'll talk about each of those. So let's actually do a fuller slideshow instead of just looking at it like this. That'll probably be a little bit better to see for you all. Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is reason for existence. Ask why. Why is the character, why did you create this character? What are their motivations? And if you have just a simple motivation, keep asking why and keep asking why a little bit more and a little bit more until you have a better idea of who they are. So at the beginning, you have Eleanor wants to become a better person. And then you ask, well, why does she want to be a better person? And it's to get into the good place to deserve it. And why, and then later, that changes a little bit, and she wants to help others become better as well. They realize that the deck is stacked against humanity. And the choices we make are a lot more complex than they were when the system was first dreamed up. But you want to think, what is their goal? So Eleanor wants to become a better person. What are their motivations for that goal? So why do they want to do that? She wants to actually get into the good place and not have to lie anymore. But then you want to think, what are they willing to risk? And at one point in time, I think season 3 and season 4, mainly season 3, they're back on Earth and they realize that they're stuck. There's nothing they can do. They're probably going to go to the bad place anyway. So let's try to make other people better. So their motivation changes. And her motivation specifically becomes wanting to make her mom a better person. And then you think, what would happen if they can't achieve their goal? And does that matter to the person? Do they stop all of a sudden striving, or do they keep trying even though they know they might not make it? And that's something to think of too. It's a very human thing. You know, we all, I'm sure, have had things that we thought we wanted and they didn't work how we thought they would. So we try something else. So that's something to keep in mind too. You want to make sure to avoid one-dimensional characters. Very few of us are all good or all bad. We have layers and we have dimensions. And we need those dimensions to feel believable. So give people flaws. Give your characters flaws, but also give them strengths. So Eleanor will talk about herself as being an Arizona dirtbag. She talks about she was a world-class liar. She did a lot of bad things on Earth, but also she's a survivor. She keeps trying. She eventually, as she starts experiencing kindness, she starts giving that kindness to others. So she's very complex. If you think about anything you've read or anything you've seen, very few characters are completely good or completely bad. And the risk of having one that's completely good or completely bad is that then they don't feel quite believable. Even, you know, Superman has kryptonite weakness. You know, if your characters are too perfect, then or too flawed without those gray areas, they don't feel like real people. And regardless of the genre you're writing in, you want your characters to have those dimensions because you want your readers to believe in them. Something to think about in order to make them a believable character is to consider these internal and external conflicts. So internal, let's start with external. What are they fighting against in the world outside? With Eleanor in The Good Place, she's fighting against this system that's put her in the bad place, this eternal damnation. And she's fighting against this because she says, well, I was a medium person, but really she still has this spark of believing in herself. And then inside, she has this fear of, maybe I do belong here. I'm not good. So you have to have both. In novels where characters go to war, they have fears inside, and they have to overcome those fears while they're fighting battles outside themselves. And even in small things. In one of the stories that you'll read this week, there's a character who has to move past her own desires to do what her spouse wants, what's the best thing for her spouse. I don't want to give away too much yet. That's something to think about. And often if a character or a story doesn't feel quite fleshed out or quite believable, it's because one of these is missing. A lot of that comes from this idea of dynamic or static characters. A static character doesn't really change over the course of the story. A dynamic character does. Main characters should always be dynamic somewhat. There's some debate. You have some characters, like Captain America gets brought up sometimes where he's always been good, but you know, he still has moments where he loses people and he falters, even in the comic books. So you want to think, how are these events changing them? How are they changing the world? And how is the world changing them? So you have Eleanor, again, who starts out that the only thing she wants is to be good, to stay in the good place. That's it. She's selfish. She just doesn't want to suffer for eternity. I mean, who does? And she's very impatient. She doesn't like studying. She starts sitting down with Chidi, another character who was a moral philosophy professor on Earth, and she starts taking these classes and she starts learning. And at first she's just like, I just want to be good so I can stay. But throughout this time, she also starts to fall in love with Chidi, and she starts experiencing these things for the first time. And that's how she changes. By the end of the story, although she still has some of the mannerisms from the beginning, and we'll talk about those in a minute, and she's still the same person at her core, she's also changed and grown a lot, to the point where in season 3, she's like, has this wonderful quote, I guess all I can do is embrace the pandemonium, find happiness, and the unique insanity of being here now. She's not as impatient. She's like, fine, I've accepted what's going on, and I'm just ready to see what's out there, see what's next. You also want to have backstory, and I combine backstory here with also external and interior characteristics because they kind of all go together. Backstory is who was the person, who was your character before the events of the story. And a lot of this won't even filter its way specifically into your story, but it helps you get to know your character enough to know why they're doing the things they do. It's hard to understand a character's motivation until you understand where a character comes from. With external characteristics, you think about those things, those mannerisms they have outside. How do they express themselves to the world? And that can be anything from from appearance to how they walk, how do they move, what kind of phrases do they use a lot. Eleanor is someone who cusses a lot. And when she gets to the good place, she learns that they're not allowed to use profanity. So she uses phrases like, holy forking shirt balls, because that's how it comes out in the good place. So no matter where she is in the story, lines like that keep coming. But we also need to know who they were beforehand. So we know that she's selfish. We know that she did a lot of unpleasant things on Earth. And more comes out sometimes that are really outlandish. But then we have this memory where she flashes back after her father's death, and she's at a store kind of like Bed Bath & Beyond, and she's buying a toothbrush holder, and then she sees a family toothbrush holder, one with 4 slots, and she has this moment. It's like, well, all these toothbrushes can be together and talk about their toothbrush feelings, and they can hold their little toothbrush hands when they're sad and make sure no harm ever comes to their bristles. So it's kind of funny. But really, we see that she never really experienced that parental love. So she grew up raised by selfish parents, was selfish herself, never was able to really express emotions. So that's what led to her behavior. When doing this, one of the things you want to think about is a character sketch. And there's a link in the slide to a template from Columbia University's Writing Lab that will let you do a character sketch. I always do these for main characters, and sometimes I'll do these for side characters as well. Especially if they may not be like the protagonist, but if they're important to the story, I need to know their motivations too. These are, and you want to think of the basics like age, economic status, marital status, appearance, race, sexuality, gender expression, and how they experience the world. And also you want to consider, do some research. If you want to have believable characters, you need to figure out who they are, where they're from. But then you also want to kind of decide, is this my story to tell? And that's a really complicated answer. So first, with doing your research, think about setting. Do you need to research dialect and speech mannerisms? If my character is set in the north of the United States, they're going to have different phrases than what I use as someone who grew up in Kentucky. If they grew up, depending on the schools they went to, they may have different expectations of vocabulary. If your character has a certain job, you may need to do some research about that job. How do similar people experience the world? So The Good Place, like I said, involved a lot of philosophy. One of the characters was a moral philosophy professor. So they actually worked with a moral philosophy professor from UCLA so that everything that Chidi wrote on his board for their small philosophy moral classes was actually legit moral philosophy. So if I was writing a character like him, I would want to do some research. If I was writing a character who had been in prison, I would maybe want to spend some time reading some interviews and narratives from prisoners. And if you're writing a character whose experience of the world is really different than you want to consider, why am I telling their story and what perspective can I write? If I'm writing a character who is trans and I'm not a transgender person, I would maybe want to ask someone who is trans to read my essay or read my story and say, did I get this right? Because sometimes when we write about characters that are different than ourselves, we fall into stereotypes. And it's not an intentional stereotype, it's just there's only so much we can learn unless we've experienced it. And you also want to consider motive. Why am I telling this story as opposed to someone who experienced it? And sometimes the answer is, I guess this isn't my story to tell. Sometimes the answer is, okay, well, I can tell this story, but I need to make sure I do justice to the story. So I have a friend who writes a lot about the Uyghurs in China, which is a Muslim population that is in what basically is concentration camps at this point. And there aren't a lot of stories about them out there. So even though she's a white girl from Kentucky, she felt, who was raised Southern Baptist, she did enough research to where her characters are still believable. And she said, well, once we start getting narratives from these people, she's like, I know then I can back off and not tell that story anymore. Sometimes it's a matter of, well, I can't write from that character's perspective. Like you see a real world event and you're like, well, I can't write from that perspective because I don't understand it. But I can write about someone similar to me who witnessed it, and I can write about those experiences. And there's a really interesting article that I'm linking in this slide, and I'm also going to assign for you this week, that gives you a little bit more to think about when telling your story. Especially for an intro class, it's okay to kind of experiment and try different things, but also be willing, or at least be willing to do the work to do justice to your characters. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And that's it for a quick mini lecture on character development. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will upload this in just a few seconds and then add a video about setting as well.